14:32 p.m., January 17th, 2025, Ashwood, Pennsylvania. The snow had been falling since noon, fat flakes that settled on the windowsills of the Ashwood veterans' home like ash from a fire no one could remember, and the radiators clanked and hissed against the cold that seeped through the brick walls of the century-old building. Clara Novak stood in the doorway of room 112, her hand resting on the frame, watching as Mr. Eugene Hartley sat in his chair by the window, his milky eyes fixed on nothing, his fingers tracing the raised letters on the cover of a Braille book he'd read 17 times. The book was about the war, always about the war, and his lips moved as if reciting prayers or coordinates or names of men who'd stopped answering decades ago. Behind Clara, in the hallway that smelled like floor wax and cafeteria soup, a therapy dog named Bauer whined low in his throat. A Belgian Malinois with a dark muzzle and amber eyes, his body tense in a way that made Clara stop and turn and look at him with the kind of attention she'd learned to give when something didn't feel right. If you're watching this story, tell us where you're from and hit subscribe so you never miss stories of courage and truth like this one. Ashwood sat in the western edge of Pennsylvania, 47 miles from Pittsburgh, a town of 9,200 souls carved into the Allegheny foothills, where steel mills had once burned day and night and now stood silent, their smokestacks monuments to a vanished economy. The Veterans Home had opened in 1947, funded by the state and built on 12 acres of sloping land that overlooked the Monongahela River, a place designed to house men who'd come back from Europe and the Pacific with bodies and minds that couldn't quite settle into civilian life. By 2025, the home had 73 residents, most of them Korean War and Vietnam-era veterans, a handful from Desert Storm, and 3 from World War II. Eugene Hartley was the oldest at 102, blinded by shrapnel at the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, his left eye lost entirely, his right eye scarred into uselessness by burns, an infection that the field surgeons couldn't stop. He'd been 19 years old, a corporal in the 106th Infantry Division when the Germans launched their last great offensive through the Ardennes forest, and he'd spent the next 80 years learning to navigate a world made of sounds and textures and memories that never faded. The home employed 14 full-time staff, including 2 LPNs, a social worker, a dietitian, and a rotating crew of caregivers who handled the daily routines of bathing, feeding, medication management, and the slow, patient work of keeping men alive who'd outlived most of the people they'd ever loved. The caregivers were mostly women, mostly local, and mostly underpaid. But they stayed because the work mattered in ways that couldn't be measured in dollars. Clara Novak was 26 years old, born with Down syndrome, a condition her mother had explained to her when she was 12 by saying, "Your chromosomes are just wired a little different, honey, and that makes you see things other people miss." Clara had worked at the home for 4 years, hired through a county inclusion program that partnered with the Department of Developmental Services to place adults with intellectual disabilities in supported employment. Her job was officially listed as caregiver aide, but in practice she did everything the other aides did. She helped residents dress and shower. She distributed medications under supervision. She read aloud from newspapers and letters. And she sat with men who were dying and held their hands and told them it was okay to let go. She was good at the work in ways that surprised people who didn't know her, patient and intuitive and unshakable in the face of confusion or anger or grief. She'd been assigned to Mr. Hartley 2 years ago, and they'd developed a rhythm, a routine built around his needs and her steady presence. Every morning at 8 a.m., she'd help him dress, guiding his hands to the buttons and zippers he couldn't see. At 9:30 a.m., she'd walk him to the dining hall, describing the route so he could build a mental map. At 11 a.m., she'd read to him, mostly war histories or memoirs, her voice slow and clear, pausing when he asked questions or corrected details. And every afternoon at 2:00 p.m., she'd sit with him in his room and listen as he talked about the war, the cold, the artillery, the friends who'd died, the guilt he carried like a stone in his chest. The Veterans Home had recently partnered with a local nonprofit called Pause for Purpose, which provided therapy dogs to facilities serving elderly and disabled populations. The program had been active for 6 months, and the dogs visited twice a week, trained to offer comfort, reduce anxiety, and provide sensory stimulation for residents whose worlds had narrowed to the size of a room. Bauer was one of 3 dogs in rotation, a 6-year-old Malinois, handled by a volunteer named Tom Breslin, a former police canine officer who'd retired after a knee injury and now spent his days training and deploying therapy animals. Bauer had been a patrol dog for the Allegheny County Sheriff's Department, trained in narcotics detection and suspect apprehension, but after a disciplinary incident involving excessive force allegations against his handler, the dog had been retired early and retrained for therapy work. Tom insisted Bauer was gentle, reliable, perfect for the job, but Clara had noticed things. The way Bauer's body went rigid when certain residents walked past, the way his nostrils flared when he entered rooms with particular smells, cleaning chemicals or medications or the faint musk of old wool. The way he growled, low and almost inaudible, when Mr. Hartley's visitor arrived. The visitor's name was Leonard Kessler, 89 years old, stooped and thin, with liver-spotted hands and a voice that rasped like sandpaper. He came every Wednesday at 3 p.m., had been coming for 11 months, ever since he'd moved to Ashwood from Erie to be closer to his daughter. He and Eugene had served in the same division during the war, though in different companies, and they'd reconnected through a veterans organization that tracked down surviving members of the 106th for reunions and oral history projects. Leonard brought cookies from his daughter's bakery, ginger snaps and shortbread, and he'd sit with Eugene for an hour talking about old times, about the Ardennes, about the men they'd known. Eugene seemed to enjoy the visits, his face brightening when Leonard's voice filled the room, his hands reaching out to clasp Leonard's in a gesture that was part greeting, part reassurance. But Bauer hated Leonard. The first time Leonard had visited while Bauer was in the room, the dog had lunged, teeth bared, a snarl ripping from his throat that made Clara jump and Tom shout and Leonard stumble backward, his face going pale. Tom had yanked Bauer back, apologizing, insisting the dog had never done that before, that something must have startled him. Leonard had waved it off, said it was fine, dogs could be unpredictable, but his hands had been shaking. Eugene had asked what happened, his voice worried, and Clara had explained, her words careful, and Eugene had said, maybe Bauer doesn't like strangers. But Bauer liked strangers. He tolerated being petted by residents with dementia who grabbed his ears too hard. He lay calmly beside men who wept into his fur. He wagged his tail when the kitchen staff slipped him scraps. It was only Leonard who triggered that reaction, that coiled aggression that seemed less like fear and more like recognition. Clara had mentioned it to Tom, who'd frowned and said, dogs pick up on things we don't. Maybe Kessler's wearing a cologne Bauer associates with something bad. Or maybe he's just got an off vibe. But Clara didn't think it was cologne. She thought it was something deeper, something Bauer's nose was telling him that no one else could detect. She started paying attention. On the third Wednesday, Leonard visited. Clara stood in the hallway outside Mr. Hartley's room with Bauer at her side, the dog on a short leash, his body tense. Leonard was inside, his voice a low murmur, and Clara watched Bauer's behavior. His ears were pinned back, his lips pulled tight, his nostrils working the air like a bellows. He wasn't growling, but his body language screamed distress. Clara crouched down, her hand on his head, and whispered, "What is it, boy? What do you smell?" Bauer whined a high, anxious sound and pulled toward the door. Clara held him back, her mind working. Tom had told her that Bauer's original training included scent detection for narcotics, firearms, and accelerants, but also that patrol dogs were sometimes trained to recognize fear, pheromones, the chemical signature of adrenaline and cortisol that humans released under extreme stress. It was a controversial practice, used mostly in interrogation settings, but it worked. Dogs could smell fear. They could smell guilt. Could Bauer smell something in Leonard that no one else could? That evening, Clara stayed late, helping the night shift prep for dinner, and she stopped by the home's small library, a room on the second floor lined with donated books and old National Geographics. She pulled out a volume on the 106th Infantry Division, a thick hardcover published in 1998 by a Veterans Association, and she sat at the reading table under the yellow light of a banker's lamp and started flipping through pages. The 106th had been a Green Division, sent to the Ardennes as a quiet sector assignment, a place to gain experience without too much danger. But on December 16, 1944, the Germans had attacked with 29 divisions smashing through the American lines, surrounding 2 entire regiments of the 106th in the Schnee-Eifel, a forested ridgeline where 8,000 men were cut off, bombarded, and forced to surrender after 5 days of fighting. It was the largest mass surrender of U.S. forces in Europe during the war, and the survivors carried the shame of it for the rest of their lives. Eugene's company, Baker Company, 423rd Regiment, had been in the thick of it. The book included a roster of men who'd been killed, captured, or wounded, and Clara ran her finger down the list, looking for Hartley, Eugene R. There it was, Corporal, wounded in action, December 19, 1944. Evacuated to field hospital. She kept reading. There was a section on the surrender, interviews with survivors, and one name kept appearing, Sergeant Raymond Tull, who'd been leading a platoon of 40 men when they were pinned down by German artillery. According to multiple accounts, Tull had ordered his men to hold a position near a creek bed while he went for reinforcements. He never came back. The platoon was overrun, 12 men killed, the rest captured. One of the survivors, a private named Wendell Marks, had been quoted in a 1989 interview. "We waited for Tull for 3 hours. The Krauts were closing in, and we had no ammo left. Some of the boys said Tull ran, that he left us there to die. I don't know if that's true, but I know we never saw him again. Clara's pulse quickened. She flipped to the roster looking for Tull. Raymond J. Missing in action, presumed captured. Status updated 1947. Returned to U.S., honorable discharge. She pulled out her phone, opened a browser, and typed Raymond Tull, 106th Infantry. The results were sparse. A few genealogy sites, a mention in a forum for WWII researchers, and then, buried in a 2003 article from the Erie Times News, a short obituary. Raymond Joseph Tull, 81, of Erie, Pennsylvania, passed away March 14, 2003. Survived by his daughter, Margaret Kessler, and son-in-law, Leonard Kessler. Clara stared at the screen. Leonard Kessler. Leonard's wife had been the daughter of Raymond Tull, the sergeant who'd allegedly abandoned his men. Leonard would have known. He would have heard the stories, the accusations, the whispers that followed Tull for the rest of his life. And now Leonard was visiting Eugene, who'd been in the same division, possibly the same battle. Why? Clara closed the book, her mind racing. She needed to talk to Mr. Hartley, but she needed to be careful. The man was 102 years old, his memories fragile, his emotions raw. She couldn't just accuse Leonard without proof, but she also couldn't ignore what Bauer was telling her. The next Wednesday, Clara arranged to be in Mr. Hartley's room when Leonard arrived. She told Tom she wanted to observe Bauer's behavior more closely, to see if they could desensitize the dog to Leonard's presence. Tom agreed, though he looked skeptical. At 3:02 p.m., Leonard knocked on the door, his voice cheerful. "Eugene, it's Len. Brought you some of Maggie's lemon bars today." Eugene's face lit up. "Len, come in, come in. Clara, is that you? Is Bauer here?" "Yes, Mr. Hartley," Clara said. "Bauer's with me. He's calm today." That was a lie. Bauer was anything but calm. The moment Leonard stepped into the room, the dog's body went rigid, his hackles rising, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Tom tightened the leash, his face tense. "Easy, Bauer, easy." Leonard set the tin of lemon bars on the table, his movements careful, his eyes flicking to the dog. "Maybe I should come back another time." "No, no," Eugene said, his hands reaching out. "Please stay. I look forward to these visits." Leonard sat, his posture stiff, and started talking, his voice too bright, too loud. He told a story about a recent trip to the grocery store, a joke he'd heard on the radio, anything to fill the silence. Eugene listened, nodding, smiling, but Clara watched Leonard's hands. They were trembling. She watched his face. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the chill in the room. And she watched Bauer. The dog's eyes were locked on Leonard, his body coiled, his nose working the air. Tom leaned close to Clara, his voice low. "I've never seen him like this. It's like he's tracking a suspect." Clara's mind clicked. "Tom, when you trained Bauer, did you ever use scent articles? Personal items from suspects to teach him to track?" "Yeah, standard procedure. Why? What kind of items?" "Anything with the person's scent. Clothes, gloves, hats. Sometimes we'd use items from crime scenes, evidence bags." Clara's pulse spiked. What if Bauer's reacting to a scent that's not Leonard's? What if it's something Leonard's carrying? Something that belonged to someone else? Tom frowned. "Like what?" "Like a war relic. Something old." Clara turned to Leonard, her voice careful. "Mr. Kessler, did you bring anything with you today? Besides the lemon bars?" Leonard blinked, his face pale. "What do you mean?" "Anything personal, something you've been carrying." Leonard hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet, worn and cracked, the stitching frayed. "Just this. It was my father-in-law's. I've been meaning to show it to Eugene. Thought he might recognize it." He handed it to Eugene, who took it with careful fingers, his face curious. "Whose was it?" "Raymond Tull's. He served in the 106th. Same division as you. I thought maybe you knew him." Eugene's fingers stilled. His face, which had been open and warm, went blank, then hard. "Raymond Tull." "Yes. Did you know him?" Eugene's voice was quiet, each word deliberate. "I knew him." The room went silent. Clara watched Eugene's face, watched the way his jaw tightened, his hands clenched around the wallet. Tom watched Bauer, who was now trembling, his growl louder, his eyes fixed on the wallet. Leonard shifted in his chair. "He was your sergeant, wasn't he? I found some old letters in his things after he died. He mentioned you, said you were a good soldier." Eugene's laugh was bitter, a sound Clara had never heard from him. "Raymond Tull was no sergeant. He was a coward." The word dropped like a stone. Leonard froze. "What?" Eugene's voice shook, but it was strong, stronger than Clara had heard in months. December 19th, 1944, near Schönberg. We were pinned down by German 88s. Our position was getting pounded, and Tull said he was going for reinforcements. He took 2 men with him, Davis and Monroe, and he told the rest of us to hold. We held for 3 hours. No ammo, no food, no orders. The Germans overran us. 12 men died. I took shrapnel to the face, trying to drag Corporal Hewitt to cover. Lost my eyes because Raymond Tull ran. Leonard's face was ashen. That's not what he said. He said he got separated, that he tried to find his way back, but the lines had shifted. He lied. Eugene's voice was flat. He lied to save his reputation. The men in that platoon knew the truth. We talked about it in the POW camp, those of us who survived. Tull made it back to the American lines, got a commendation for his service, and never spoke about what he did, never apologized, never admitted he left us there to die. Leonard's hands were shaking violently now. He carried that guilt his whole life. He had nightmares. He drank. My wife said he'd wake up screaming about the Schnee Eifel, about the men he couldn't save. Couldn't save? Eugene's voice rose. He didn't try to save us. He ran, and because of him, good men died. Boys who should have come home, who should have had families and lives, they died in that snow because their sergeant chose himself over them. Bauer lunged. Tom barely held him back. The leash straining, the dog barking now, a deep, furious sound that echoed off the walls. Clara grabbed the wallet from Eugene's hands and held it out to Bauer. Such, she said, using the command Tom had taught her. Find. Bauer's nose hit the wallet, and his entire body went still. He inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring, and then he sat, rigid, his eyes locked on the wallet. It was an alert, the same alert he'd been trained to give when he found narcotics or evidence. But this wasn't drugs. This was scent memory. Tom stared. He's alerting on the wallet. Clara's voice was quiet. He's smelling fear. Raymond Tull's fear. It's soaked into the leather. 80 years old, and Bauer can still smell it. Leonard stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. This is insane. The dog's reacting to leather, to mold, to anything. No. Eugene's voice was cold. The dog knows. Animals know things we hide. You came here to make peace for your father-in-law, to clear his name. But the truth doesn't change just because he's dead. Raymond Tull abandoned his men, and we paid the price. Leonard's eyes filled with tears. He was a good man. He made a mistake. He was 19 years old, terrified, trying to survive. So were we. Eugene's hands were shaking now, his voice breaking. We were all 19. We were all terrified. But we stayed. We held the line. And Tull ran. The room was silent except for Bauer's low growl. Clara looked at Leonard, at the broken man standing in the doorway, and she felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't about justice. It was about truth, about the weight of secrets carried across decades, poisoning everyone they touched. She spoke carefully, her voice gentle. Mr. Kessler, why did you really come here? Leonard's face crumpled. Because my wife died last year, and before she died, she told me her father had confessed to her. Told her what he'd done, how he'd left those men, how he'd lied about it his whole life. She said it destroyed him, and she made me promise I'd find the survivors, tell them the truth, ask for forgiveness on his behalf. He looked at Eugene, his voice raw. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry for what he did. For the men who died, for what you went through. Eugene sat motionless, his face unreadable. Clara watched him, watched the way his hands opened and closed, the way his breath came fast and shallow. She knew that look. It was the look of a man standing at the edge of a decision between rage and release. Tom spoke quietly. Bauer's not reacting to Leonard. He's reacting to the scent of trauma embedded in that wallet. Dogs can detect cortisol, adrenaline, the chemical markers of extreme stress. Raymond Tull carried that wallet through the war, and it absorbed his fear, his guilt. Bauer's trained to recognize those markers. He's not attacking Leonard. He's alerting on the evidence. Eugene's voice was hoarse. What do you want from me, Len? Leonard's tears spilled over. I don't know. Forgiveness, maybe. Or just acknowledgement. That it happened. That it mattered. Eugene was silent for a long time. Then he said, It did happen. It did matter. 12 men died because your father-in-law was a coward. I've lived 80 years blind because of that decision. I'm not going to tell you it's okay. It's not okay. I know. But, Eugene's voice softened just slightly. Carrying his guilt won't bring those men back, and hating him won't give me my sight. The war's over. We're the last ones left. Maybe it's time to let the dead rest. Leonard sank into the chair, his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Eugene reached out, his hand finding Leonard's arm, and he gripped it. Not gently, but firmly. Your father-in-law was a coward, but you're not. You came here. You told the truth. That takes more courage than he ever had. They sat like that for a long time, two old men and the ghost of a third, the weight of 80 years pressing down on them. Bauer finally relaxed, his body loosening, his tail dropping. He moved forward cautiously and rested his head on Leonard's knee. Leonard's hand, trembling, touched the dog's head. Clara stood by the window, her eyes wet, watching the snow fall outside. She thought about how much weight people carried, how many secrets lived inside families, how truth could be both poison and medicine. Tom clipped Bauer's leash and moved to the door, giving the men space. Clara followed, but before she left, she looked back at Mr. Hartley. His face was turned toward Leonard, his expression unreadable, and she wondered if this was forgiveness or just exhaustion, the recognition that anger was a burden too heavy to carry into whatever time he had left. In the hallway, Tom looked at Clara, his face thoughtful. "You knew, didn't you, that something was wrong?" Clara nodded. "Bauer told me. I just had to listen." "That's a hell of a thing, using a dog to uncover an 80-year-old war crime." "It wasn't a crime," Clara said quietly. "It was a mistake, a terrible mistake, but Mr. Kessler's trying to make it right. That's something." Over the next weeks, Leonard continued to visit, though less frequently. He and Eugene talked, not about the war at first, but about other things, about Leonard's grandchildren, about Eugene's time in the POW camp after his capture, about the small mercies of surviving. Bauer no longer reacted to Leonard. The scent of fear had faded, or perhaps the dog recognized that the threat, such as it was, had been neutralized. Clara watched the two men grow something that wasn't quite friendship, but was closer to understanding. They were the last witnesses to a moment in history that the world had moved past, and they carried it together now, the weight divided. Eugene asked Clara to write a letter for him. He dictated it slowly, his voice measured, and she wrote it down in careful script. The letter was addressed to the families of the 12 men who died on December 19th, 1944, near Schönberg. It explained what had happened, what Raymond Tull had done, and it ended with this: "I have spent 80 years angry at a man who's now dead. But anger changes nothing. It does not bring back the lost. It does not heal the wounded. I am writing this so that you know the truth, so that your fathers and grandfathers are remembered not just as casualties, but as men who held the line when others did not. They deserved better. We all did. But perhaps now they can rest." Clara mailed copies to the addresses she could find, tracked down through veterans organizations and genealogy websites. Some letters were returned, the recipients deceased or moved, but 3 families wrote back. One thanked Eugene for his honesty. One expressed rage that the truth had been hidden so long. And one, from the grandson of Corporal James Hewitt, the man Eugene had tried to save, wrote, "Thank you for trying to save my grandfather. Thank you for remembering him. That's all we ever wanted." Eugene kept that letter on his nightstand, and Clara read it to him every morning. The Veterans Home held a small ceremony in March, recognizing Clara and Bauer for their roles in what the director called an act of historical reconciliation. Clara stood awkwardly on the stage, Bauer at her side, while the director praised her intuition, her compassion, her willingness to trust what others dismissed. She didn't feel heroic. She felt tired and sad and grateful that Mr. Hartley seemed lighter now, his voice less heavy, his smiles coming easier. Tom Breslin expanded his therapy dog program, adding a component on trauma scent detection, teaching handlers to recognize when their dogs were alerting on emotional distress rather than physical threats. He credited Clara with the idea, and she blushed and said it was Bauer's idea, not hers. Eugene Hartley died on a Sunday morning in late April, 3 months after Leonard's first confession. Clara found him in his chair by the window, the Braille book open on his lap, his face peaceful. The staff said it was a heart attack, quick and painless, the kind of death you hoped for when you were 102 and tired. Leonard came to the funeral, standing in the back of the chapel, his face drawn. After the service, he approached Clara, his voice thick. "Do you think he forgave me? Forgave my father-in-law?" Clara thought about that, about the letter, about the visits, about the way Eugene's hand had gripped Leonard's arm that day in the room. "I think he made peace," she said. "That's not the same as forgiveness, but it's something." Leonard nodded, wiped his eyes, and left. Clara stood in the cemetery watching them lower Mr. Hartley's casket into the ground, and she thought about how much history lived inside people, how much pain and pride and guilt, and how rarely it ever came out. She thought about Bauer, about the way the dog's nose had cut through 80 years of silence and forced the truth into the light. She thought about the men who died in the snow, about Raymond Tull, about the cost of cowardice and the cost of courage. That evening, she sat on the porch of her apartment with Bauer at her feet. Tom had let her take the dog home for the night, said he trusted her to handle him. Bauer lay with his head on her boot, his eyes half closed, his body relaxed. Clara scratched behind his ears and whispered, "You're a good boy. You did something important." The dog's tail thumped once against the wooden boards, a quiet acknowledgement, and Clara realized that this was what mattered. Not the big gestures, not the ceremonies or the headlines, but the small acts of truth-telling. The moments when someone listened to what couldn't be spoken and gave it voice. Mr. Hartley had lived his whole life with a wound that never closed, and in the end, it wasn't medicine or therapy or time that healed it. It was a dog who smelled fear, and a young woman who trusted what the dog was saying, and a man brave enough to carry his father-in-law's shame into the light. The snow had stopped falling, spring was coming, and in the ground at Ashwood Cemetery, 12 names on a memorial stone finally had a story that was complete. painful and true and finished at last. Character count 27,847. I will continue the narrative to reach the required 40,000 plus characters. The weeks after Eugene's death moved slowly at the veteran's home, each day blurring into the next with the rhythm of institutional life. Medications dispensed at the same hours, meals served on the same schedule, the same faces in the same chairs in the day room where the television played reruns no one watched. Clara continued her rounds, assigned now to help 3 other residents, men in their 80s and 90s whose wars had been Korea and Vietnam, whose traumas were different but no less real. She read to them, helped them dress, listened to their stories, but part of her mind stayed in room 112, stayed with Mr. Hartley and the way his face had changed that afternoon when Leonard Kessler had walked in, carrying his father-in-law's wallet. She couldn't stop thinking about what Bauer had done. The dog had unlocked something that had been sealed for 80 years, not through aggression or training, but through the simple act of smelling the truth. Tom Breslin had explained it to her in technical terms, talking about how scent molecules could embed in porous materials like leather, how a dog's olfactory system was so sensitive it could detect compounds in concentrations as low as parts per trillion, how emotional states like fear and stress released specific pheromones that altered the chemical signature of sweat and sebum and could persist for decades under the right conditions. But Clara thought about it differently. She thought Bauer had smelled not just fear, but unfinished business, the kind of weight that clung to objects when the people who'd carried them had died without resolution. The County Veterans Services Office reached out to Clara in early May, asking if she'd be willing to speak at a training session for caregivers working with elderly veterans. They wanted her to talk about recognizing signs of hidden trauma, about the importance of listening not just to words but to behavior, about how animals could sometimes bridge gaps that human communication couldn't. Clara was nervous, her hands shaking as she stood in front of 40 caregivers in a conference room at the county building. But she told the story as best she could. She talked about Mr. Hartley, about Leonard, about Bauer and the wallet, and the way truth had emerged not from interrogation, but from attention. She talked about how people with Down syndrome often saw things differently, processed information through different pathways, and how that difference could be a strength rather than a limitation. The caregivers listened, some taking notes, some nodding, and afterward a woman in her 50s approached Clara, her eyes red. "My father was in Vietnam," the woman said. "He's in a nursing home now, dementia, and he has nightmares every night. Screams about things he won't talk about when he's awake. I've tried to get him to open up, to tell me what happened, but he just shuts down. Do you think a therapy dog could help?" Clara thought about it. Maybe, not to make him talk, but to help him feel safe enough that he doesn't have to carry it alone anymore. The woman thanked her, and Clara left the building feeling something she hadn't expected, useful. Not in the way she was useful at the veterans' home, doing tasks and following routines, but useful in a larger sense, as if her experience mattered beyond just her own life. Tom Breslin had been right. What had happened with Bauer and Mr. Hartley wasn't just a personal story, it was a window into something bigger, something about how trauma lived in bodies and objects and could be inherited across generations, and how healing required not just time, but truth. Leonard Kessler called Clara in June, his voice hesitant. "I wanted to let you know I'm moving back to Erie. My daughter's not well, and she needs help. But before I go, I wanted to give you something." They met at a coffee shop in downtown Ashwood, a place with brick walls and mismatched chairs and the smell of espresso. Leonard looked older than he had 3 months ago, his face more lined, his hands trembling as he slid a small wooden box across the table. "This was Raymond's," Leonard said. "His medals, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, the usual decorations. He was a war hero on paper, but after hearing Eugene, after learning what really happened, I can't keep them. I thought maybe you'd know what to do with them." Clara opened the box. The medals were tarnished, the ribbons faded, but they still carried weight. She thought about Raymond Tull, about the 19-year-old boy who'd made a terrible choice in a moment of terror, and how that choice had defined the rest of his life. She thought about the men who died because of that choice, and about Eugene, who'd lived 80 years carrying the cost. "Mr. Kessler," Clara said slowly, "these belong to your family. Raymond Tull made a mistake, but he also served. He also suffered. I think you should keep them, but maybe add something to the box. A letter or a note explaining what happened. So the next generation knows the whole story, not just the medals." Leonard's eyes filled. "You think he deserves that?" "I think the truth deserves that. And your grandchildren deserve to know their great-grandfather was human, that he failed and that failure mattered, but that he also tried to live with it. That's harder than being a hero." Leonard nodded, took the box back and held it against his chest. They talked for a while longer, about small things, about Leonard's daughter, about Clara's work, and then they said goodbye. Clara watched him walk to his car, a hunched figure carrying a box that weighed more than bronze and ribbon. The story could have ended there, but it didn't. In August, Clara received a package in the mail, a padded envelope with a return address in Delaware. Inside was a letter and a photograph. The letter was from a woman named Sarah Hewitt Davis, the granddaughter of Corporal James Hewitt, the man Eugene had tried to save on December 19, 1944. The letter read, "Dear Miss Novak, I received your letter on behalf of Mr. Hartley earlier this year, and I wanted to thank you for sending it. My grandfather died before I was born, and my father rarely spoke about him, so I grew up knowing only that he'd been killed in the war. Your letter gave me something I didn't know I needed, a story, not just of how he died, but of who tried to save him, and why it mattered. The photograph I'm enclosing was taken in January 1944, a few weeks before my grandfather's unit shipped out to Europe. He's the one in the middle, smiling, with his arm around another soldier. I don't know who the other soldiers are, but I thought maybe you could find out. Maybe one of them knew Mr. Hartley. I know Mr. Hartley has passed, and I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to thank him in person, but I wanted you to know that his letter meant everything to my family. My father cried when he read it. He said it was the first time he understood his own father as a person, not just a name on a memorial wall. Thank you for caring enough to write, and thank you for listening to that dog. It sounds strange, but I think animals understand things we've forgotten how to hear." With gratitude, Sarah Hewitt Davis Clara held the photograph under the lamp in her living room, studying the faces. 5 young men in uniform, their smiles wide, their eyes bright with the kind of confidence that came before you understood what war actually meant. She recognized the name stenciled on one man's jacket, Hartley. Eugene, impossibly young, his eyes clear and sharp. His arm slung over the shoulder of a soldier whose name tag read Hewitt. Clara's throat tightened. She scanned the photo, brought it to the veterans' home the next day, and showed it to the director, who contacted the Army's Historical Division. They identified 3 of the 5 men, all killed in action, December 1944, all part of the same platoon that had been pinned down near Schönberg, all left behind when Raymond Tull ran. The director suggested creating a memorial display in the home's main hallway, a small exhibit honoring the men of the 106th Infantry Division, with the photograph at the center and a plaque explaining what had happened. Clara helped design it, writing the text carefully, making sure it told the truth without cruelty. These men served with honor. They held the line when it would have been easier to run. They died because war is chaos, and because one man made a choice that cost them their lives. We remember them not with anger, but with gratitude for their sacrifice, and with the hope that truth, even painful truth, can bring peace. The exhibit opened in September, and families of the men came from across the country. Sarah Hewitt Davis was there, along with relatives of 2 other soldiers, and they stood in front of the photograph with tears streaming down their faces, touching the glass, whispering names. Clara stood in the back, watching, and she felt Bauer press against her leg. Tom had brought him for the ceremony, and the dog seemed to understand the weight of the moment, his body still, his eyes watchful. One of the family members, a man in his 70s, approached Clara. "You're the one who wrote the letters." Clara nodded. "I just wrote what Mr. Hartley told me. You gave my uncle a story. He was just a name to me before. Now he's a person. That's a gift." Clara didn't know what to say, so she just nodded. The man crouched down, scratched Bauer's ears. "And this is the dog who started it all." "Yeah, that's Bauer." "Good boy," the man said, his voice thick. "Good boy." The ceremony ended with a prayer, and then people drifted to the reception area for coffee and cookies. Clara slipped outside, needing air, and found herself standing in the veterans' home garden, a small plot of grass and flower beds where residents sat on good days. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn, and the air smelled like cut grass and roses. Tom joined her, Bauer at his side. "You okay?" "Yeah," Clara said, "just thinking." "About what?" "About how much pain people carry and how hard it is to let it go." Tom nodded. "You did something important, Clara. You gave people permission to tell the truth. That's rare." "I didn't do anything. Bauer did." "Bauer alerted. You listened. That's the work." They stood in silence, watching the sky turn orange and purple. Bauer lay down at their feet, his body relaxed, his eyes half closed. Clara thought about Mr. Hartley, about the way his face had looked in those final weeks, lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted. She thought about Leonard Kessler, about the box of medals and the letter he was probably writing to his grandchildren. She thought about the families who'd come to the ceremony, about the way they'd touched the photograph, about the grief that was finally, after 80 years, beginning to settle into something bearable. "Do you think it made a difference?" Clara asked, telling the truth. Tom looked at her. "Do you?" Clara thought about that, about Eugene's letter, about Sarah's gratitude, about the memorial in the hallway, about the way the men's names were no longer just names, but stories. Yeah, she said. I think it did. The autumn came, and with it the slow turn of the year. Clara continued her work at the veterans' home, continued reading to residents and listening to their stories and holding space for their grief. She and Tom expanded the therapy dog program, training 3 more dogs in trauma scent detection, teaching handlers to recognize the subtle signals that indicated not danger, but distress. The program gained attention, written up in a veterans magazine, featured in a segment on a local news station, and Clara found herself invited to speak at conferences and training sessions across the state. She was always nervous, always worried she'd say the wrong thing, but people listened. They asked questions, they thanked her, and slowly she began to understand that her way of seeing the world, her way of processing information wasn't a deficit. It was a perspective that others needed. On a cold evening in November, almost a year after the day Bauer had first growled at Leonard Kessler, Clara sat in her apartment with a cup of tea and a notebook. She'd been writing down memories of Mr. Hartley, small things she didn't want to forget. The way he'd tilt his head when he was listening, the way his hands moved when he was telling a story, the way his voice would crack when he talked about the men who'd died. She wanted to make sure those details survived, that when she was old and her memory faded, there would be a record. She thought about how history was made, not by monuments or textbooks, but by moments like these, by a blind man confessing pain to a young woman who listened, by a dog who smelled fear embedded in leather, by a grandson who carried his ancestors' shame into the light and asked for forgiveness, by families who gathered around a photograph and said, "This is who they were. This is what happened. This matters." Clara closed the notebook and looked out the window. The snow was starting again, fat flakes drifting down through the yellow glow of the streetlights, and she thought about how winters came and went, how seasons turned, how time moved forward even when the past refused to let go. But maybe that was okay. Maybe the past wasn't supposed to let go. Maybe it was supposed to be carried, not as a burden but as a responsibility. To remember, to honor, to tell the truth, even when the truth was hard. Clara picked up her phone and texted Tom, "Can I take Bauer for a walk tomorrow? I want to visit Mr. Hartley's grave." Tom's response came quickly. Of course, he'd like that. The next morning, Clara drove to Ashwood Cemetery with Bauer in the passenger seat, the dog's head out the window, his ears flapping in the cold wind. She parked near the section where the veterans were buried, rows of white headstones marching up the hillside, and she walked slowly through the snow, Bauer at her side, until she found Eugene's marker. It was simple. Eugene R. Hartley, Corporal, U.S. Army, 1922-2025. He held the line. Clara knelt in the snow, her hand on the cold stone, and she whispered, "I miss you, Mr. Hartley. I hope you're at peace. I hope you found the men you were looking for." Bauer sat beside her, his body warm against her leg, and together they stayed there for a long time, 2 beings who understood that some debts could never be repaid, some wounds never fully healed, but that bearing witness was enough. That remembering was enough. When Clara finally stood, her knees cold and wet, she looked out over the cemetery at the rows of stones marking lives lived and lost, and she thought about all the stories buried here, all the truths waiting to be told, and she promised herself that as long as she was able, she would listen, she would pay attention, she would trust what the dogs and the silences and the small, overlooked details were saying, because that was the work, not saving people, not fixing the past. Just making sure it was seen, acknowledged, carried forward with care. Clara and Bauer walked back to the car, their breath visible in the cold air, and as they drove away from the cemetery, Clara glanced in the rearview mirror at the rows of white stones disappearing behind them, and she whispered one last time, "Thank you for teaching me what listening means."